Hi, my name is Eliza Watford, and today I'm going to be reading my research paper entitled Anti-Slavery Sentiment in Benito, Cereno. So we'll go ahead and get started. Herman Melville's adaptation of Amasa Delano's A Narrative of Voyages and Travels, Benito, Cereno, has perplexed readers for decades. The novella's sources of puzzlement are twofold. First, while the majority of scholars, including Sidney Kaplan, Brian Yothers, and Alan Moore Emery, to name a few, have long accepted Melville's intentional exaggeration of Captain Delano's naivety in Benito, Cereno, they diverge in their understanding of its purpose. Secondly, although scholars such as Warner Berthoff and Rosalie Feltenstein agree that Melville's Benito, Cereno is morally ambiguous and, consequently, has caused much confusion when it comes to interpreting the text, an academic consensus has not been reached in regards to Melville's intentions for crafting his narrative this way. My argument seeks to build upon the musings of previous scholars in an effort to piece together a guide for interpreting Melville's Benito, Cereno. Reading the novella with its historical and literary context in mind, while paying close attention to Melville's use of irony, especially through his adaptation of Captain Delano, reveals the text's anti-slavery aims. In order to perceive these sentiments in Benito, Cereno, the reader must first understand that Melville's ambiguous treatment of morality is strategic. It is through the novella's complexity that Melville prompts the reader to explore the act of interpretation, to ponder the meaning behind seemingly obscure characters and events, in order that he may instruct his readers in their understanding of slavery. A starting point for discerning anti-slavery sentiment in Benito, Cereno is understanding the function of Captain Delano in the text. It is generally accepted among scholars that Captain Amasa Delano's character has been intentionally embellished by Melville from the story's original publication and Delano's own A Narrative of Voyages and Travels. It is true that, in both Benito, Cereno and Delano's narrative, Delano is portrayed as a rather naive character. Delano explicitly characterizes, quote, the temperament of his mind, end quote, as being, quote, unusually pleasant, end quote, crediting this disposition as the reason he was able to escape, quote, falling victim to the slave's power, end quote. In Benito, Cereno, too, Delano is described as possessing good feelings, such as, quote, good nature, compassion, and charity, end quote, which ultimately saves his life. The critical difference between Delano's characterization of himself versus Melville's, though, is that whereas in A Narrative of Voyages and Travels, Delano's temperament is portrayed as a saving grace, in Melville's Benito, Cereno, it has both a saving and a damning effect. Indeed, Delano's life was spared because of his alleged benevolence towards the slaves, but his naivety also costs him the self-reflective and observatory skills necessary to notice the events transpiring aboard the ship, as well as the evils of the slave institution at large. Melville, by recreating Delano's character in this way, is encouraging readers to perceive Delano as naive. Melville repeatedly suggests that Delano's perception of reality is skewed and thus presents a challenge to the reader. Will the reader be able to decipher the truth regarding the ship's circumstances as well as the complexities of slavery in general, or will the reader subscribe to Delano's ignorance and consequently be left with a tainted view of the world? Perhaps Melville's most pointed remark of this kind occurs at the novella's outset. Melville writes that, quote, whether in view of what humanity is capable, Delano's singularly undistrustful good nature implies, along with a benevolent heart, more than ordinary quickness and accuracy of intellectual perception may be left to the wise to determine, end quote. Here, readers are told that if they are wise, paying close attention to Delano's thoughts, attitudes, and actions throughout the novella, they will uncover the truth about Delano's less than astute intellectual perception. While scholars agree that Melville intentionally exaggerates Delano's naivety, quote, it is at the point where agreement stops and divergence begins that we find the crux of the problem of Benito, Cereno, end quote. According to Kaplan, this crux can be found in the difference between schools of thought concerned with Delano's inability to, quote, discern the motiveless malignity in Babbo and his fellows, end quote, versus his inability to perceive the, quote, innate and heroic desire of the Negroes for freedom to their dignity as human beings, end quote. Other scholars describe this crux as the difference between Delano's, quote, innocence of human cruelty and evil outside himself, end quote, versus his, quote, lack of self-knowledge caused by his unacknowledged racism, end quote. In either case, what is being described by scholars can be boiled down to whether or not Delano's ignorance is a matter of outward perception of reality versus inner self-awareness, specifically as it pertains to personal biases and racism. While both sides of this crux have merit, the distinction being made is trivial. Rather than seeing these readings of Benito Cereno as opposed to one another, we should perceive them as being intertwined. It is because of Delano's inability, or, more accurately, his refusal to recognize his own racism, that he is unable to discern the events transpiring aboard the ship and humanity's evil in the world at large. By casting Delano's racism as the culprit for his ignorance, Melville prompts his readership to associate racism with ignorance. Delano's unacknowledged racism is blatantly obvious at multiple points throughout the novella. Weaved throughout the novella's entirety is Delano's subscription to the widespread belief in black docility at the time that Melville wrote Benito Cereno. To find evidence of such beliefs, one need look no further than Delano's inner dialogue on page 90. Quote, "There is something in the Negro which, in a peculiar way, fits him for avocations about one's person. They possess a certain easy cheerfulness, harmonious in every glance and gesture, as though God had set the whole Negro to some pleasant tune." End quote. Here, it is clear that Delano believes in an inherent inferiority and docility in African slaves, as he imagines them to be set apart as a class of willing servants. By the novella's end, though, this belief of Delano's is exposed as delusional. Far from being submissive, the slaves have masterminded a performance for their guest, Delano, in order to deceive him from the reality of what has taken place on board, namely, their violent revolt against their captors. Delano's misjudgment is epitomized by the character Babbo, who, throughout the greater portion of the novella, is thought of by Delano as the image of a perfect and loyal servant, but who, at the end of the novella, is revealed to be the leader of the revolt. Delano's severe misjudgment of Babbo and the other slaves on board serves to challenge believers in the myth of black docility. To be clear, quote, "Melville was acquainted with contemporary arguments for black docility and sought to attack them by means of his naive protagonist," end quote, by disproving him. Melville is not only pointing out the ludicrousy of Delano's belief in black docility, but is pointing out the absurdity of this belief for any of his readers who may, like the naive Delano, believe in such a myth. While it could be argued that Melville overcorrects the belief in black docility by portraying the slaves in an exceedingly violent light, it could also be argued that the slaves' violence is a matter of righteous anger, and that it is entirely justified. They are only exercising violence because the white man's own violence and greed has forced them to, after all. This is an example of one of many instances in Benito Cereno wherein Melville's intentions may confound the reader at first, but which, after further thought, reveal Melville's invitation to the reader to dwell upon complex circumstances and craft meaning for themselves. Accepting this invitation to meditate upon Melville's treatment of black docility throughout the novella, paying close attention to the idea's refutation at the novella's end, will almost certainly lead readers to an understanding of Melville's commentary as being saturated with a distinctly anti-slavery air. Melville is strategic in choosing which scenes, characters, and ideas to develop, and which ones to leave open for the reader's interpretation. Similar to his treatment of black docility, Melville approaches the problem of evil and corrupted morality in a convoluted fashion, allowing space for readers' own interpretations while infusing the plot with subtle anti-slavery sentiments to act as guideposts. To demonstrate morality's ambiguity in Benito Cereno, we may ask, who does Melville seem to posit as the morally upright character of the novella? Delano, Cereno, Babbo? As 21st century readers, we understand that Babbo was fighting for his liberty, certainly a worthy cause, even if it meant resorting to violence. But is this who Melville is treating as the moral figure in Benito Cereno? Or is Delano, who holds racist beliefs but is presented as a mild-mannered man of good nature throughout the novella, supposed to be the moral hero? To some, it may seem as though positioning Babbo as a supremely violent leader was not a progressive choice, given this characterization's potential to justify the beliefs and actions of slavery's proponents. They may interpret Babbo's violence as evidence that slaves need to be tamed and subordinated under white rulership. One literary scholar, Rosalie Feltenstein, concedes that Melville's characterization of the slaves is exceedingly violent, while, at the same time, pointing out that Melville must have known he'd be answering to his readership's objections, quote, that evil had originally been done to the slaves, given that he was writing when the anti-slavery movement was at its height, end quote. Feltenstein asserts that Melville purposefully characterized the slaves as violent because he, quote, knew that it would add more power to his treatment of the baffling ambiguity of evil, end quote. In other words, by painting a thoroughly corrupted picture with no purely moral, non-violent heroes, Melville treats morality as an enigma. Melville is setting readers up to ask questions about who and what is good and evil. He is provoking us to puzzle over the morality of Benito Cereno and to interpret the text with agency, for a lesson is more meaningful when discovered by the learner themselves. Though Melville presents readers with a complex plot line and characters to allow readers to construct meaning for themselves, this is not to say that Melville does not give readers suggestions throughout the text, or that there is no way of deducing Melville's intentions. Putting Benito Cereno in the context of his readership and the magazine in which the novella was published allows us to see that Melville's primary moral concerns are largely attached to participation in the slave economy. The magazine that Benito Cereno was published in, Putnam's Monthly Magazine, was, quote, a publication that combined literary experimentation with social concern and had a didactic goal of elevating Americans' moral and aesthetic sensibilities, end quote. In terms of slavery, this took the form of condemning slavery, but not necessarily those who participated in the institution, for, quote, attacking the individuals who conducted the unseemly business would be indecorous, end quote, and could spin the country into further disunity over the issue. Considering that many of the contributors held anti-slavery beliefs, it logically follows that Melville's novella would fit into the magazine's anti-slavery scheme. Additionally, realizing that many of Putnam's Monthly Magazine's contributors, while willing to condemn slavery as a practice and institution, were not willing to risk the country's unity by condemning participants in the slave economy, helps us understand part of why Melville's Benito Cereno does not make blatantly anti-slavery statements, but rather shrouds its instruction in subtleties. Taking a close look at Putnam's goals and patterns helps to clarify the likelihood that Benito Cereno is intended to communicate anti-slavery ideas in a relatively non-frictional manner. As a result, we are able to deduce that Melville's treatment of morality, while at times ambiguous and difficult for the reader to interpret, is presumably aimed at condemning slavery. Putnam's Monthly Magazine, as previously mentioned, was highly concerned with preserving national unity, often achieving this by condemning slavery without explicitly criticizing those who participated in it. Melville may have shared these concerns, and this may be part of why his moral instruction is akin to a riddle. However, there also exists the possibility that Melville, through his character of Delano, is condemning, or at least calling attention to, the compromising behavior of Northern moderates, including those who are more concerned with preserving unity than establishing freedom for their black brothers. When Benito Cereno was published in 1855, quote, Northern moderates were grappling with the implications of the Compromise of 1850 and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, measures that revealed the degree to which whites above the Mason-Dixon line were complicit in the evils of slavery, end quote. Like Northern moderates who complied with slavery despite their conviction against it, and like the contributors to Putnam's who straddled the fence between condemning slavery and turning a blind eye towards those who promoted it, Melville's Delano embodies compromise. Even though Delano's behavior most often reflects racist beliefs, he does, at times, acknowledge that slavery is wrong. Delano admits this at one point as he inwardly exclaims, quote, ah, this slavery breeds ugly passions in man, end quote. After this realization, Delano chooses to continue participating in the slave economy, recapturing the slave ship after the slaves had gained their freedom. This, too, adds to Delano's ignorant characterization as he is portrayed as inconsistent, unwilling to allow his recognition of slavery's evils to guide his actions. In this way, Melville may be casting Delano as a symbol of the hypocritical Northern moderate who at once denounces slavery but still complies with it. In keeping with Melville's writing style in Benito Cereno, this interpretation of Delano is not obvious. It is something that has to be searched out and meditated upon in order to find. There may be hints, such as the recurring use of the word half, which, quote, appears 29 times in the novella, end quote, in order to, quote, put readers in a mind of compromise, end quote, but Melville does not directly communicate this meaning to his readers. In addition to the insights we gain from putting Benito Cereno in its literary and historical contexts, we also find evidence of Melville's anti-slavery sentiments by considering the novella's treatment of morality at its end. After Delano's beliefs in black docility have been radically contradicted and the slaves' revolt has had its full effect, Delano and Don Benito Cereno converse about their experience aboard the San Dominick. Delano, after having been proven so utterly wrong about the slaves' docility and fitness for servanthood, and after having witnessed firsthand the African's intelligence, cleverness, and strength, nevertheless walks away from his experience unchanged. He says to Don Benito, quote, the past is past, why moralize upon it? End quote. Cereno's response to what has taken place is the complete opposite. He is terrified of and haunted by, quote, the Negro, quote, Babbo, now that he knows what Babbo and the other slaves are capable of. This is the, quote, essential dichotomy of the tale, the opposition between Cereno, who knows what depraved man can do, and Delano, who owes his survival to his inability to perceive the truth, end quote. The juxtaposition of these two responses is intentional. Readers are shown two vastly different responses to what has ensued and are invited to evaluate which one is logical. Should the past be moralized upon? After having read the novella and gotten to know Delano's character, we know that Delano's perception is not to be trusted, for his insights have continuously been proven wrong. We are thus inclined to conclude that Delano's response to the slave revolt is unreasonable and that Don Benito's is fitting. In this way, Melville posits Benito Cereno as enlightened and Delano as ignorant. Will Melville's readers join Cereno in his enlightenment by recognizing the African's intelligence and humanity, or will they, like Delano, overlook the evils of man? Throughout Benito Cereno, it is clear that Melville wants his readers to craft their own meaning from the events and characters presented to them. Melville will not explicitly dictate what is right and wrong for his readers because it is more effective for readers to discover the truth for themselves. Frederick Douglass, in his What to a Slave is the 4th of July speech, pointed out the merit behind this way of morally instructing Americans. He claimed that, since, quote, there is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven who does not know that slavery is wrong, the time for such argument is past. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed, end quote. This indeed is what Melville seeks to provide in his novella, scorching irony, especially through the character of Captain Delano, whom he consistently mocks, but who represents many Americans' mentalities in the period. To interpret Melville's writing as prescriptive for how Americans should react to slavery, then, is to misunderstand his intentions. Instead, he must be understood as a literary artist who communicates through irony to make a point which has been unsuccessful when made through literal, straightforward reasoning. While this may seem to be an unorthodox and, at times, frustrating mode of communicating for his readers, we may also learn to, quote, appreciate his achievement in Benito Cereno by seeing how all this more is built directly upon ambiguity, end quote. It is through his use of ambiguity and irony, then, that Melville spurs readers to explore the various interpretations and moral implications of Benito Cereno, ultimately leading them towards an acceptance of anti-slavery sentiment in his novella.